Are you confused by all the claims about the best diets, what foods to avoid, and the never-ending list of nutritional fads highlighted in books and headlines? We are too. And in today's episode, we're going to do something about it. Welcome to the Catalyst 360 podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching 360, and today's guest is Dr. Mario Kratz, the founder and director of Nourished by Science, an evidence-based resource I have a feeling everyone is going to be tapping into after hearing this episode. Dr. Kratz has been on the faculty for the Department of Epidemiology and Medicine, as well as the Nutritional Sciences Program at the University of Washington, and intimately involved in the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington. He now focuses his time providing trustworthy, rigorous, and evidence-based information about nutrition, health, and chronic disease for those like us who share his passion for science and a healthy lifestyle. On the coaching front, if you're a coach and you've not yet registered for the Rocky Mountain Coaching Retreat and Symposium that takes place September 22nd through the 24th in Estes Park, Colorado, right as the elk are wandering around, the aspen leaves are changing, please do not wait another day. We're ordering the bonus gifts for all registrants this week, and housing will fill soon. All the details, including group discounts and the 6-month no-interest option, are available under the Retreat tab at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And if you're an employer or benefit consultant looking for ways to support the physical and mental well-being of employee team members, Catalyst Coaching 360 might be exactly what you've been seeking. Best-in-class personalized coaching you can integrate into any current program or platform. Reach out anytime. Results at catalystcoaching360.com. Or you can check out the website catalystcoaching360.com. And now it's time to push aside the fads, ignore the headlines, and dig into what the evidence tells us about nutrition with Dr. Mario Kratz on the latest episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast. Your information is so in line with what we do here with evidence-based practices, so thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brad. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, as I looked at your history, it seems like you've known that you wanted to devote your life to the study of nutrition from the early stages of your career. You look at your degrees you pursued, there wasn't this bouncing all over the place thing. What got you started down that path, or is there something behind the curtain that we don't see on your CV?
Yeah, for sure. So on my career path, yes, but let's go back a little bit further, actually. In middle school, high school, I was just like your average teenager, really. I was doing a lot of sports. I played volleyball, basically, like 2-3 hours every day.
Wow.
And I would come home and just eat whatever, a whole bag of chips, a whole pint of ice cream, 5 sandwiches. Like, it's crazy, but the amounts, but also the quality was really just lacking. And I just didn't care, really. I didn't know anything about it. And really what changed this is I had an aunt and an uncle. They both were a little bit like my older sister and brother, because they were maybe, my aunt was, I think, 5 years older than me. My uncle, maybe 8 years older than me. But as I was growing up, they were just often over at our place and played with me, whatever, tennis. And, my aunt would just help me through the struggles of puberty, because she was, 6 years further ahead. So she would give me dating advice and stuff like that.
Yeah.
My aunt got a really bad case of multiple sclerosis, and actually she died within 5 years or so. That was a horrific experience to kind of see. My uncle, he had a heart attack that required coronary bypass surgery at age 29, had a heart attack before that. So the issue is that when I was just deciding what to do for college, like where to go, and I studied in Germany, so that's a bit different. As you enter college, You have to decide already which program you enter into.
Right.
It really dawned on me probably that year before college that I had treated my body as if I had a second one in the closet somewhere. And wow. I really felt like,
good analogy.
I think we need to be better to ourselves, to give our body what it needs so that we can kind of help it along as it helps us through this life, right? And that really got me interested. I got to talk to a few people, and they said, hey, you should really study medicine or nutrition, something like that, or biology at least. I had always wanted to be a mathematician at that time. Architecture was maybe the other option, but I more or less, I don't want to say on a whim. There was a few months where I thought about this, but pretty quickly changed that and enrolled in a nutrition program.
Wow.
I will say ever since my kind of conviction that we need to focus heavily on prevention has really been strengthened ever more. I think when we look at any kind of condition, be it heart disease or autoimmune diseases or type 2 diabetes, yes, there are ways we can get better if we change our lifestyle or diet specifically, but the power actually to prevent these conditions by making small tweaks and then having these more healthy lifestyle choices over many years, I think that is a much more substantial lever, in my opinion.
Not waiting until that fire starts.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And so, so with my new endeavor and also with my academic career, I was really heavily focused on trying to understand, what are the factors that trigger the development of, specifically in my case, academically, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and what can we do to prevent these types of conditions from emerging in the first place, right?
And that's what we want to dive into today. Your work, it's so needed. Why is it that nutritional misinformation seems to be so rampant? And obviously now in the age of social media, it's gotten ridiculous, but I'm mid-50s. I remember long before social media, it still seemed to be all over the place. I know you don't know the answer to that question, but what's your thought in terms of why this misinformation is just so rampant and seems to always have been this rampant?
This is something I've actually thought about a lot, because I do think the misinformation is not just kind of annoying; it's potentially harmful.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It's something that I go to some of these channels, and maybe we'll touch on this later. Some of these outlandish claims that are made there, that, in my opinion, are actually harmful to people's health. But I do think it's two factors. One is nutrition is a notoriously difficult science, right? I mean, you understand that, I think.
So many variables.
As much as anyone. It's difficult to understand what we eat, the complexity of all the foods that we're eating, how that relates to the development of a complex multifactorial disease, say, such as heart disease or an autoimmune disease or neurodegenerative diseases, right? And so I think nutrition has, in the past, when we first started being interested in nutrition, let's say, 100 years, 140 years ago or so, we learned that we can make a lot of advances in nutrition by focusing on one factor, trying to identify the one factor that would cause a disease. Because in those days, mostly what society struggled with were micronutrient deficiency diseases, right?
Sure.
And so figuring out, okay, what's the one micronutrient that we need to give people to avoid scurvy or beriberi, right? That was really the major focus. And I think when we moved beyond that to the area of non-communicable diseases, like, the chronic diseases that plague us today mostly, initially we tried to use that same mindset, right? So starting in the 50s, maybe 1950s, 60s, 70s, people were eager to try to figure out, okay, what's the one factor that causes people to have heart attacks? And I think that's largely where they saw these associations between, say, fat intake or saturated fat intake and the incidence of heart disease, right?
Right.
And they would say, that's plausible, saturated fat, that's clear. Let's do some animal experiments. Oh, yes, in animals, they raise cholesterol. Oh, in people too. And it seemed like basically the solution was found. And I think the problem is, we, at the time, in this eagerness to identify nutritional causes of these conditions, scientists at the time overstepped the evidence in terms of the conclusions they drew. What they should have said is, we have first suggestive evidence from low quality observational studies, right? Initially, these were really poor types of studies where we looked at a country level, not even a population, not even like an individual level intake. Like ecological studies where we basically just said, okay, well, people in Greece seem to eat less saturated fat than people in Finland, and the Finnish people have more heart attacks. Right. So that seems to be the factor.
Extrapolate out. Exactly. Yeah.
And so I think they should have just drawn very, very careful conclusions. Instead, what we did is they drew strong conclusions. Books were written, big newspaper articles. Butter was on the cover of Time magazine. And the U.S. dietary guidelines immediately implemented that and said, stay away from saturated fat, lower your fat intake, instead eat grains without specifying what kind of grains, I think the focus was way, disproportionately heavy on the fat and the saturated fat, where it really wasn't justified by any kind of science that was around at the time. So that's, I think, one factor. But the other that I see today with the misinformation is, so in other words, what I say is, that people are skeptical of nutrition sciences and are looking for other kind of explanations for maybe their own illness. I understand, I totally sympathize. If I had heart disease or diabetes, or I was obese or something, I would be looking for answers as well. And I may very well also be dismayed with the governmental advice over the years, right? I understand where people are coming from. The other thing I think strongly explains what's been happening is the need for humans to form tribes. This is really something that I think applies heavily here. When I read Noah Yuval Harari's books on these topics, where he says, humans have thrived so much beyond any other animal on this earth, because we're able to form tribes and believe in bigger, more abstract concepts, which allows us to create money, allows us to create religion, right? And at the same time, that may also be our downfall, because it also allows us to create tribes in areas where maybe it can mislead us,
because you want to grasp onto something. It's like, I want to be a keto guy or a low-fat guy or a veggie guy or a vegan guy or a gluten-free guy or whatever. It's like you want to have that as part of your identity. And
you become part of a community, right?
Yeah.
It becomes part of a community of us against them, right? And so people, in my mind, say, if you want to have a successful YouTube channel, as you know, I started a YouTube channel just recently. I am very much aware I'd be much more successful if I attached myself to one of these communities.
Yes.
If I said, okay,
or something extreme. We want the extreme. Give us the extreme. Don't be in the middle, Mario. Come on, give us the extreme.
No, I know it's foolish, but I feel like what we really need is a much more unbiased approach. Where because I feel like if I was putting myself into some camp based on what I eat myself or whatever other conviction I have, and new evidence came out on the opposite, let's maybe say I start a keto channel and a new paper comes out that says, well, keto triggers whatever, heart disease.
Right.
Would I really be open to talking about that, honestly, or would I try to talk it away, and basically make it sound like bad science,
Right.
And so I do think it's understandable that people want this community, that people want the tribes, the conviction into something that they do, particularly when you change your lifestyle so much, right? You give up all the cakes and all the things, and you want to at least feel like you're doing it for bigger goods than,
Right.
So I do think it's totally understandable why we have this tribalism in nutrition and why we have so much misinformation. But I think that makes it particularly important to say, people, let's wait a second here. This is insane, I understand, you, John, and you, Barb, you had diabetes, type 2 diabetes, you were obese, you went on keto diet or even carnivore diet, and you lost 100 pounds and your diabetes went away. That's wonderful. I'm so excited about people. I often have tears in my eyes reading these stories, and I've done clinical research on people who've, basically had major life and health transformations. But
that can't be extrapolated across the entire population because of Barb and I don't remember who the other name was you gave. But
John, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so and we're gonna talk about your website, but Nourished by Science, folks. We got to support this guy. Like, get out. Mario and I have no connection. He's just our guest today, but you got to get on his website. We've got to support the thoughtful middle. We talk about that all the time here. The extremes are not where the value is. We've got to go with the evidence-based practices. So good job. I know it's early, but you need people singing your praise because it's so important what you're doing.
Well, I think the big issue that I'm seeing currently to kind of continue with that idea with John and Barb, who lost a lot of weight and reversed their diabetes, is that now they're so excited about keto. They're basically not open to anything else.
Exactly.
Right? Anyone who is healthy on a vegan diet, that can't be right, for one. But the other thing is they may have LDL cholesterol levels of 250 milligrams per deciliter. And their cardiologist may say, oh, you're at increased risk of heart disease now. And they may say, I don't think so, because, so-and-so on the carnivore channel says that doesn't matter.
Right.
And I think that is the kind of then misinformation that I think people should watch out for, because it is very well possible that a carnivorous diet or keto diet can help you lose a lot of weight, reverse your diabetes, but it could still be harmful in other ways.
Right.
And I do think it's not going to be good for your health to, just ignore all of that simply because this way of eating helped you so much. And, I understand the psychology behind this, but I do, I would kind of recommend people to try to remain open to what the science actually says and not believe everything they hear on these types of channels that in my mind are too often a little bit more like a religion than based on science.
Exactly what it is. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Can you pull from your memory bank some of the claims that have made you roll your eyes the most in the last, 6 months or so, where you see something, you go, are you flipping kidding me?
Mm-hmm. So one is, I don't want to mention names. I don't want to call people out at all, but I will say specifically what the claim was. So there's a prominent person who has a carnivore channel, and he's also written a book about it. And in the book, he says something to the effect that his LDL cholesterol is something like 550 milligrams per deciliter, but that's not anything of concern, because in the context of a low carb or carnivorous diet, if you're metabolically healthy, that's a good thing. And I can't say I rolled my eyes, but it's more like I'm really concerned and frustrated, because if people believe this could cost a lot of people their life, because there's absolutely no evidence that that having such a high cholesterol level is not going to be harmful for you in the context of, depending on what your diet is or depending on what your metabolic health is. It's maybe it's an interesting hypothesis.
That needs to then be studied and not just claimed as a theory.
I would agree with that, because, if Brad, if you were following the carnivore diet and you had cholesterol levels like that, would you bet your health on this individual's opinion being correct?
Well, I mean, if it was my religion, I would. I mean, that's your point.
And I think that's the point. So to me, that is the kind of stuff that I think I think is unfortunate, because we should be, great for people if they have success with certain diets. Sure. Stay open to evidence to the contrary, and evidence that suggests, okay, maybe here's a point where you want to watch out, and maybe at least then be open to medication or changing the source of your fats and so forth, right? Other claims, I think there's huge claims out there on plant foods generally being toxic. That is similar community, actually. There's a lot of overlap there. I think that is also potentially harmful one. And that's also something I've actually looked into quite a bit. Because, so let's say lectins are a good class of molecules. Not sure if your listeners are familiar with that, but lectins are a group of proteins that you find in, say, beans or grains a lot, but also in certain vegetables, like nightshade vegetables, like tomatoes and bell peppers and eggplant. And lectins are a really interesting class of proteins. And I'd say there is some evidence from mouse studies where investigators used very high doses of lectins ordered from a lab that had negative health effects, let's just say, in these mice. And then some people have come and written books about this and, made this into their whole spiel, really, that lectins are the cause of all disease. And I'm not kidding. There's several individuals out there who make those claims, and they're very popular. And when we look at, this, what I think is interesting is that, as you know, I really value kind of nuance in this field. I am not someone who says, all rubbish, lectins are great, we should all eat lectins. No, for sure. There's actually good evidence. Lectins are not great. They at least give us some GI distress. In some individuals, lectins may actually be contributing to some conditions, But when we look at the totality of the evidence, it cannot be a coincidence that in populations all over the world, those that eat the most, say, legumes, which are the most lectin-rich foods, beans, lentils, and so forth, they tend to be the healthiest across the board, right? And even within populations, those that eat the most legumes, they tend to be among the healthiest. So how we can just ignore all of that evidence and build on just mouse experiments using 100-fold higher doses of lectins than humans will ever be exposed to in a lab experiment and then draw a conclusion from this and scare the entire population into staying away from legumes, staying away from vegetables. Again, I think that's unfortunate because, what I think people need to know here is maybe that these foods, vegetables, including nightshades, legumes specifically, but also whole grains, I would actually say as long as we prepare them correctly, which we know is important to actually reduce the lectin content to almost zero, they're not just safe to eat, they are consistently associated with the best health outcomes, right? And so I think people get, particularly when people have these types of conditions, like if you have Parkinson's disease or you have, multiple sclerosis, it's, in my opinion, it's again very easy to try to fall prey to someone like that who basically suggests they have the answers to all of your health problems.
I mean, it's the age-old magician coming into town and selling the stuff and then leaving town again. Write a different book.
I understand that, but let me ask people, if you see something like this, be a little ask yourself, what's the motive here? Does the person actually also happen to sell a lot of supplements?
Exactly. Follow the money, folks. Follow the money.
And make a huge amount of money with a gazillion books on exactly the same topic. I feel like there's really a need for some, nuanced information. If I were to give a talk about lectins, I'll definitely make a video about this. I will say, yes, there are maybe some foods that even when we eat them, they may still have some lectins. And if you have these and these health issues, maybe consider staying away from these foods for a while to see if it makes a difference. I'm not saying there's nothing at all to the story, right? It could be, but I feel like people coming out and writing books and saying, again, based almost exclusively on these mouse experiments, that lectins are the cause of all disease. That, in my opinion, is just the modern version of snake oil salesperson.
Totally.
And is not going to be beneficial to the health of the population or individuals who are following these people.
Absolutely. Folks, I hope you're hearing what he's saying. Don't fall for the snake oil. Anyway, you made a comment that with legumes and grains and some of those things, if they're prepared correctly, we won't dig into the depths of this, but could you give a brief version of what you mean by that?
Yeah. So as I've mentioned, lectins are actually really interesting class of proteins. And I can't claim I've reviewed the entire literature, but easily hundreds of papers on this topic. They are really interesting. They do have certain properties that could harm us. And so as a result, for example, if you manage to eat a few raw kidney beans that are not cooked, just the dried ones that you buy in the bulk section at the grocery store, they do still have the kidney bean lectin in it. And your body would not be able to digest it effectively because lectins, as one of their potentially damaging properties, they're not well digested. And so they would actually make you very sick. You could actually, from some of these lectins, you can even die in fairly low doses. So ricin, for example, is a lectin from legumes that has traditionally been used as a poison. And so it's clear, yes, lectins are not good for us. But if you follow the normal methods of preparing legumes, where you ideally soak them and then you cook them for a long enough time, ideally pressure cook them even. And that's similar if you buy a canned legume, like a canned bean, for example, they're basically already
pre-done.
Pressure cooked. Yeah.
Okay.
If you can eat them, if they're soft and mushy, if they're still hard, I would say don't eat them. But if you can eat them, they're pleasant to eat, the lectin content from all the research we know has been reduced by 99.something%. The lectins are almost entirely gone.
Interesting.
And so similarly with grains, actually, and that's maybe an interesting point for people to understand. So traditionally, when people have made whole grains, they've understood that the whole grain would ideally be fermented, like say a sourdough fermentation. And in the process of the sourdough fermentation, what we know is some of the lectins actually in, say, wheat get degraded. So wheat has a very potent lectin as well, wheat germ agglutinin. And that gets degraded in the process of the fermentation. And then when you bake the bread, again, further it's being degraded. And then in the bread, when you eat it, there's basically very little in it that actually is still bioactive. But when we take these shortcuts today, where we're not doing the sourdough fermentation, but we're having a factory produced kind of bread, and now because we need to eat whole grain, they're going to put a few whole grains in there. We're not having the fermentation necessarily. I'm a little unsure that that's a good thing, or even in some cases, we're adding actually extracts. We're adding extracted gluten and we're adding extracted things to bread in a factory, and we're not following the traditional procedures. I am open to the idea that may not be a good thing. And so people may want to watch out for those types of issues where, we've just deviated from the traditional way in which we've eaten some of these foods. And we're basically now in the industrialized food system, we're inventing new ways of making these foods in a quicker, faster, cheaper way. And I'm not saying this is dangerous, but I'd say it's possible that there is some potential for issues in some people.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. We just had Charles Mann, who wrote The Wizard and the Prophet on recently, and he gets into some of the history behind the food changes and the biochemistry and all that. So interesting connection there. The U.S. Department of Agriculture promotes the My Plate visual, and most people have seen this. It shows varying amounts of fruits, veggies, grains, protein, and dairy. As you look at that, I know there's been a lot of discussion around that, and there's recently been some changes to it. What are some of your thoughts based on the evidence you've reviewed in terms of that general diagram? Again, everyone's individual. What's exactly right for you is going to be a little bit different for me. But in your perspective, in all the evidence that you've looked at, what's your thought on that My Plate?
So call me a little bit biased because I know several individuals who are serving on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. So I know for sure this is a ton of work that people go through. They look through thousands of papers. And really, I think what people first thing they need to know is this is not an easy task, to make a recommendation for all population.
Absolutely.
And people, I think, really are working hard to, extract the best information from the literature, because often I'm really sad to see how often these guidelines get attacked by people just saying, this is all rubbish, But it's easy to complain. It's much, much harder to come up with something yourself based on such a huge body of evidence. And particularly come up with it for an entire population. That's a big task. And I'll explain in a minute what I mean with this. Let me maybe first say I'm not 100% in agreement with everything the guidelines recommend or do not recommend. And let me just pick one thing. Currently, the guidelines say that people should eat a certain amount of grains, and at least 50% of those grains should be whole grains. What that implies is that the guidelines are fine if you eat about half of your grains as refined grains. And that's actually what is happening as well, right? Because the guidelines are being used to implement school meals.
Yeah, exactly.
In hospitals and so forth. And so, in my opinion, that's not in line with the evidence. If I was on the Guideline Advisory Committee, I would not be okay with that, simply because I think the evidence is pretty clear that eating a lot of refined grains, like white bread, for example, white rice, there's really no health benefit with that. I mean, it's cheap maybe, and it's abundantly available. Right. But in my opinion, those are the types of foods we should all aim to limit. In my mind, they're all what I would call actually treats. There's no nutritional value to eating a white wheat bread.
Right.
It's filling, maybe, you can add your jam to it or your peanut butter and jelly. But, in my mind, that's not something that the government should even be fine with. Right? Yeah. So, and I'm not saying they're recommending this explicitly, but the way they're wording it, they must be aware it's more or less such that people will continue to eat a lot of refined grains. And I think that's not a good thing. What I will say otherwise, though, is there are also a lot of things in the guidelines that say, for example, you should eat a certain amount of fruit, or you should eat a certain amount of dairy. And I would argue, well, on an individual level, you can be totally fine, actually have perfect health if you eat a good whole foods, nutrient-dense diet, even if you never touch fruit and even if you never touch dairy. But the one reason why I'm saying the guidelines are still fine the way they are is that what the guideline committee needs to be aware of is the consequences of their recommendations on a population level. And I've actually been involved in heard a lot of talk about these types of things and read a lot of papers on this. So let's assume, for example, the guidelines committee said, oh, let's just say we're not going to recommend dairy anymore. We're going to take out dairy. We'll say, it's fine if you want to eat dairy, but you don't have to. Dairy are not recommended anymore. What happens is that, broadly speaking, the average person is not going to replace the dairy with broccoli and kale and kidney beans. Yes. They're going to replace it with something else that's similarly affordable and similarly available and convenient, right? So rather than take a yogurt to school, the kids may have a Snicker bar. Yeah. And the schools specifically, right, they have such a small budget and dairy is fairly cheap. And so if they suddenly were no longer giving out dairy, what would they replace it with? So it's fair to say, in my mind, that for it being population-based recommendations, the guidelines are fine with me because they do make it very clear that they recommend largely unprocessed, or only moderately processed foods that are nutrient dense. And they still allow for, on an individual level, they allow for a wide variety of foods, right? So if any one of your listeners were to actually study the guidelines carefully, you could eat any kind of diet and still be more or less, compliant with what the guidelines suggest. It's not like you actually need to eat the grains, but as long as you follow the other recommendations and you eat your pieces of protein, be it from animal foods or from, say, legumes, you eat some whole nuts, you eat some vegetables, you eat some fruit, you eat some dairy, you're going to be largely in line with what the guidelines actually suggest. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but what I feel quite strongly about is that people need to realize that these are population-based guidelines and that there's a lot of thinking behind how these guidelines will affect the actual provision of foods in institutions, schools, prisons, all of that. And that's a big part of this that we should consider. And that the committee is very aware that changing the guidelines may, in many cases, have consequences that are not intended. Like what I said earlier, if they didn't recommend dairy, the nutritional quality.
The Snickers bar salesmen are thrilled.
Yeah, exactly. they would. I think almost certainly the nutrient content of foods would certainly not be beneficially affected if the guidelines suddenly said don't eat dairy. Right.
Okay. All right. So big topic. Just recently, prior to setting up this interview, a study came out on time-restricted eating. A lot of people think of that as intermittent fasting. Key aspect, you've looked at it. What have you found? What are some of the lessons from this? Is it a study we should tune into? Is it one we need to keep our eye on? Is it one that we throw out? What are your thoughts on this? Because it's getting a lot of attention online. And frankly, one of our most popular episodes of all time was Dr. Mark Mattson. And he's the most published researcher in the world on intermittent fasting. What do you think? Yeah,
so for those listeners who are not very clear on what time-restricted eating is, right? So time-restricted eating is what this paper is about, is a certain form of intermittent fasting where usually we're eating just in a small window of time during the day.
Like a 16-8 is very common, folks. You don't eat for 16 hours. There are variations of that, but that's a good summary. Thank you.
Yeah. And so that's really based on experiments that were done initially about 10 years ago in Sachin Panda's lab at the Salk Institute, where in mice, they saw that if they give mice a diet on which they became obese, like a high-fat diet, they would eat all day, basically, even wake up, during times when they're sleeping because they like the high-fat diet so much to just eat a little bit of it. And so they did this very simple experiment where they restricted access to the high-fat diet to just 8 hours, a day, and basically allowed them to eat only during these 8 hours, and they had to fast for 16 hours. And interestingly, the mice, they learned that, they would have access to this yummy food only for 8 hours. So they ate disproportionately more, eventually eating almost as many calories as they did when they had access to it for 24 hours. But interestingly, they didn't gain any weight. And what they found in this experiment actually was that the resistance to weight gain, was not because they ate less calories, but because they burned more calories. So energy expenditure was a lot higher. And I think that idea, took off like a rocket, because people like the idea that, maybe if I can still eat whatever I want, maybe even overeat and still not gain weight because my body just burns it off. That's wonderful. I think we'd all sign up on that. And so basically, there's now been several attempts in humans to try to look into this exact phenomenon. And as a matter of fact, I've tried many times with Sachin Panda to get grants funded on this topic and not been successful. But by my count, there are now 6 studies that were longer than 8 weeks or so. So the duration of the studies were 8 weeks to 1 year. And they have looked into the effect of different versions of time-restricted eating on weight loss. And so the newest one that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine on April 21st is the biggest one of all of them. It had 139 participants, I think, that were randomized to basically restrict their calorie intake by 25% from baseline. So they were eating 75% of the calories they were eating before the study. Or the same calorie restriction plus, as you mentioned, 16-8 time-restricted eating. So eat only for 8 hours a day and then fast for the remaining 16 hours. And in that study, they actually did early time-restricted feeding, which means you start eating at about 8 a.m. and you eat only until 4 p.m. And then you fast for until 8 a.m. the next day. And so, long story short, what they found here was that there was weight loss in both groups, but not greater weight loss in the group that did time-restricted eating. And at least, the difference, there was a difference of about 4 pounds or so between the groups, but that wasn't statistically significant.
Gotcha.
And now, what is interesting is that when we look at that study specifically, what we, in a little bit more detail, what we find is that people in the TRE group were able to reduce their calories.
TRE is time-restricted eating.
Time-restricted eating, yeah. Sorry.
That's okay.
So people in the time-restricted eating group were able to reduce their calorie intake consistently throughout this entire year that they were on this intervention, more than people who were just, attempting to restrict their calories and not doing time-restricted eating. And when we look at the trend in weight loss, I would say, this study didn't show a statistically significant difference in weight loss, but they had a fairly high threshold that they were able to detect. In a clinical trial like this, you set a threshold before you even do the study. So these investigators, when they set out to do the study, they said, we want to be able to detect the difference of at least 2.5 kilos or 5.5 pounds between these two intervention groups. And I'd say in a study in which you're already restricting your calorie intake, that's a pretty high threshold to jump over. Particularly because, if you already have weight loss, that also means there's a large variation in the weight loss within each group. And then it's really difficult to detect such a large, what we call differential weight loss, right?
So let me just say that back. So they were not just looking for which participants saw more than 5.5 pounds lost. They were saying, in order to show a difference, if you lost 12 pounds and I lost 8 pounds, we wanted to see it. That would not qualify because that's only a 4 pound difference. Is that exactly what you're walking out here? Okay.
So exactly. So people in the control group that only did the calorie restriction arm, they lost 6.3 kilos, and that's probably, let me do the math, like 13 or 14 pounds or so. So let's just,
which is significant.
Yeah. It's significant, right? Yeah. So people in the calorie restriction plus time restricted eating arm would then have to lose that amount, let's say 14 pounds plus 5.5, which is 19.5.
Yeah.
They did lose a bit more. They lost about 4 pounds more, but not 5.5 pounds.
Gotcha.
And so that difference was not statistically significant. But what I do think we need to realize is kind of two things from this. One is that in humans, it's very clear now from this study and other studies, time-restricted eating is not the kind of miracle intervention that it seems to be in mice, where there's some miraculous additional burning of calories, increase in energy expenditure that somehow makes us just drop pounds like crazy. What I do think, though, is possible is that in humans, time-restricted eating can help a little bit with additional weight loss. There have been a few other studies that actually have shown additional weight loss in people on time-restricted eating. But there's probably two things that need to happen for that to actually be successful. You need to maintain it for a substantially long enough time. So if you just do it for 2 weeks, you're not going to drop pounds like crazy. So you need to basically make it a lifestyle that you adhere to at least, I'd say, 5 or 6 days of the week, right? And the second thing is you need to probably restrict your eating window more substantially than people did in this study. Because in this study, this was done in a Chinese population. You could argue people were already time restricting their eating at baseline because their eating window was less than 11 hours, which is substantially less than the 14 to 15 hours that we're mostly seeing in the United States in most people. Yeah. And so if you reduce your eating window from, say, 11 to 8 hours, what this study shows us is that the effect on weight loss in the context of this particular calorie-restricted diet is, minimal. Maybe there's no benefit, but maybe there's a minimal benefit.
But if we compared somebody that has a snack before bed, 9 p.m., gets up, starts again at 7, so you've got, 10 hours in there. So they're doing more of a 14, not an 11. They're doing a 14-10 versus a 8-16. That could make, that'd be a completely different variables that they did not look at in this study.
They didn't, exactly. So this was, again, in this Chinese population, people were basically having already a fairly narrow eating window.
Right, that's important.
And I would argue that likely diminished the effect of going onto an 8-hour time-restricted eating, regimen. And then add to that they were already calorie restricting, which means it's more difficult to actually detect an additional effect. Because in my opinion, actually, I always felt the premise of time-restricted eating in humans, unless we really think there could be this huge boost to energy expenditure, but I felt one benefit could be that it really helps people stay away from snacks. That's more or less how I use it, for example. I don't do this religiously, but I usually don't have any calories after dinner.
Right.
Because in the past, particularly when we had little kids and we were sleep deprived, I know you have kids, you probably went through this. My wife and I would go roam the house looking for potato chips and ice cream in the evening. And so
you're kind of hitting home now, buddy.
So for me, actually, to just resolve to usually, and I'm not religious about it. If we have friends over and play a game, I'll have a few chips or something. But usually I'm not having any alcohol or calories after dinner. It just helps me kind of be a little more disciplined there and not even think about whatever food we have in the house.
Well, that was one of my questions for you is, did they ask that in the study at all? Because I hear so many people saying the ease of it is what they like. They don't have to think about it. They don't eat after dinner. They don't eat before 8, 9, 10 in the morning, except for their black coffee. And so it takes no mental energy to do time-restricted eating because it's just what you do versus somebody who says, no, I'm going to be restrictive. I'd love to see a subjective survey something with this group to find out, did those who just restricted have more mental anguish, more emotional energy into it versus the folks that just said, hey, I'm just doing the 16-8 thing. It's a piece of cake.
Yeah, they didn't ask for it. So that's exactly one thing I would have liked actually to see, that they have a questionnaire at least asking, okay, how easy was it for you to maintain this calorie restriction? Right. Because my suggestion is, and the data tell us that story a little bit, because as I've said, people were supposed to reduce their calorie intake in both groups by design, right? I think by about 600 kilocalories or so would be 25% of their baseline calorie intake. But consistently throughout the study, calorie intake was about 100 kilocalories lower in those that also did time-restricted eating.
Interesting.
And what that means to me is it was probably easier for them to calorically restrict. And that may actually be a benefit of time-restricted eating, that it just makes it a little less painful, because no one likes to actively restrict their calories. Right. So I'd say that's still a possibility. And I'd say the study leaves open the possibility, so that people understand this correctly. It leaves open the possibility that even in this context of restricting your calorie intake window by only an additional 2 or 3 hours, from 10.5 or 11 to 8, and in a context where you're already restricting your calories, it's still possible that you could basically get some additional weight loss. And that would also be in line with other studies. Like there's a couple other studies in which the eating window was more strongly restricted, in the United States, say from 14 to 8, or in one other study from about 13 and a half to 10, to 8, and another from 15 to 10. So about a 5-hour reduction in the eating window. And in both of those studies, they saw significant weight loss in people doing restricted eating.
Interesting.
So what I think the conclusion is from all of these studies together, and the new study is consistent with that, is that time-restricted eating is not a miracle intervention in humans that makes you drop tens of pounds all by itself. But I would say it can likely add a few pounds of weight loss, if you just implement it without doing anything else, even if you don't want to lose weight. And if you add it to other interventions, like calorically restricting, or what I would actually prefer, improving your diet quality.
Right.
I'd say it can add an additional kind of element, be an additional tool that can just make it a little bit more likely for you to be successful.
Right. All right. Fun rabbit trail. I need to bring us back, but I knew people would be into this thing because they're seeing the study out there. They're hearing on it. Maybe a weird question here. I'm making my salad at lunch today, and that's kind of what I have every day. It's just, whatever veggies we got in the house, all mixed together and put in some kind of protein source, little olive oil, salt and pepper, good to go, rock and roll. And I was just thinking, I wonder if there've been any studies, and my guess is no, but I'm curious if you see anything on the horizon about this, of enhanced digestion or enhanced utilization of the body of the nutrients that are already there, as compared to, let's say, I don't know, I made the salad the day before for myself and I just pulled it out of the fridge, sit down at my desk, put it away. No digestive juices in my mouth as I'm cutting up the peppers, no standing position that gravity helps get things flowing, none of the pausing from life. I don't know. Have you seen anything like that? I'm just curious if that's a thing or if we just don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Actually, I think in general, you're touching on something interesting. And that is, to me, there are probably a lot of factors that affect the health effects of the foods that we're eating, like how stressed we are, for example, like all of this eating in front of computers or TVs or while we're driving. I'd say, again, there's no hard data, but I'd say for sure that does make some difference, specifically in terms of how well, for example, we perceive our satiety. There's actually some research there. Let me correct that. For those issues, there's clearly research showing that we eat more calories when we eat in front of the TV or something like that.
Oh, of course. Absolutely. Distraction.
Yeah. I also feel strongly that you have a different relationship with your food if you grow some of it yourself.
Yep.
And I heard in a previous podcast, you do some of that as well.
Yes.
Just like the act of harvesting it and doing that. But I am not entirely aware that there's like hard outcomes attached to that people have looked into, okay, well, what's the absorption of certain micronutrients and, is the bioavailability higher, for example, or is the secretion of digestive juices higher? If that's the case, it would make some sense, right? Because in a way, you're preparing your body for food intake.
Right.
You do this. But I'm not even sure if anyone's looked. So I don't think so. I've never come across anything like this. And
you can call up Dr. Panda after this interview and be like, hey, I got our next one. Let's put in for grants on this one. All right. Very good. All right. So flip-flopping, generally credited to politicians, but it seems to be true in nutrition as well. For someone who's not you're following it all. You're on top of it. I'm talking to all these folks, so I'm kind of on top of it. But what does the average person do that's hearing on Monday that eggs are the worst possible thing you could ever have, and on Wednesday, eggs are critical for your nutrition, and on Tuesday, they find out that milk's terrible, and on Thursday, milk's the best thing, and it just seems like we're hearing the back and forth, and probably a lot of that is the lack of nuance that you mentioned earlier. We're not tuning into the nuance. We're looking for the headline. We're looking for the book concept. We're looking for the speaker that's going to be the next keynote at the conference instead of the reality of those nuances that exist. But any guidance for that person who wants to follow the evidence but is stuck in the headlines?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. So the biggest advice I would have for people is to look for sources that reflect on the totality of the evidence.
Okay.
And with totality of the evidence, what I mean is if you're interested, say, in whether eating more eggs will give you heart attacks, don't just look at one study, and particularly not a study that's just portrayed in a newspaper outlet or a magazine or a YouTube video. Like what I'm trying to do with my videos, and that's a big challenge because it quickly becomes too academic and too comprehensive.
I get you. Yep.
Like when I looked at the time-restricted eating study, for example, for my last video, I did review, the 5 other studies that had looked at the same question. And I wasn't happy with it afterwards because, to be honest, I feel like it's a bit too much like an academic presentation,
Sure.
like a YouTube video.
Right.
But the reality is for people, if you read, say, the New York Times titling, "Red meat causes colon cancer," almost certainly that is not based on several randomized controlled trials where people were fed red meat versus no red meat, and then they waited 20 years to see who got colon cancer. It's almost certainly based on an observational study. The problem is that both the authors and the journals, but also the news media, they're incentivized right now to make outsized claims, basically.
Need those clicks.
I call it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If they had a headline that said something like, red meat intake associated with colorectal cancer in 55 to 65-year-old Asian women, but not in Caucasians, no one would click that one, right?
Right.
So
it wouldn't fit in an article. That takes a whole paragraph.
Yeah, exactly. I understand why they're not doing it, but at the same time, I think we need to educate people to not fall prey to this. So ideally, find sources where now someone actually looks at all of the evidence, not just this one paper, but all of the evidence, say, on colorectal cancer and on red meat intake and colorectal cancer, or eggs and heart disease, right? Try to look at not just one study, but the totality of the evidence, right? And that, in my opinion, is how ideally we would communicate the science. And I understand myself, this is difficult, and it's actually even just a challenge to make that appealing, right? Yeah. And because it's not directly appealing to people, because sometimes if you look at the totality of the evidence, it's a lot more complex than just looking at that one study. The one study found nicely red meat causes colon cancer. Well, okay, if now you look at all the studies, maybe there's something that didn't show this, or that showed certain other outcomes, and maybe they defined the red meat intake differently. Maybe it was just processed red meat that actually seemed to be a problem in some studies, but then the other studies didn't actually differentiate between unprocessed and processed red meat. So quickly, I think, communicating it like this becomes a challenge because the average person doesn't want to know about all that detail.
Of course.
All they want to know
don't
is,
have time for it. Yeah.
Can I eat the salami? Can I eat the steak or not? You know?
Exactly.
And I would love to give people that feedback. But the problem is that if you take these types of shortcuts and just tell people, okay, yeah, unprocessed red meat, safe, salami, not safe, that is also a problem, because I think in my mind, you need to at least provide a little bit of justification. Why is that? So people really understand what's going on. So it's in my mind, it's a communications problem. And a problem in this fast world where we're incentivized to make outsized claims that are clickable. And I know every news outlet is under pressure to do exactly this, right? To produce, they're all being measured by how much people click on their stuff. And so I don't blame them again, but I do think as a consumer, look for things that are not based on one study, but on the totality of the evidence, all the studies that were done on that particular question.
And I know that's what the effort you're trying to make with your website. And folks, again, we'll have the link to that in the description below. So definitely check that out. It's going to be a great resource. That's why we reached out to Dr. Kratz in the first place. All right, my friend, final question. If you had a magic wand, you can get the definitive answer to any nutritional question that you do not know the answer to yet. What would that question be? Just one. You just get one.
That's a fun one, actually. Well, I would probably say I'd really like to know the relationship between the foods we eat and different aspects of immune system activation, so inflammation or autoimmune reaction. Because it's likely to me that there are strong relationships between, say, having a low-grade chronic inflammatory, being in a low-grade chronic inflammatory state, which is kind of involved in almost all chronic disease we know. Neurodegenerative, but also heart disease. Type 2 diabetes is also actually low-grade inflammatory. I used to study that in my lab. But we don't really know exactly where does this inflammation come from. In some cases, it may be unspecific or just the result of over-consuming calories. But there may also be specific dietary components that play a role in this. And specifically, I think with autoimmune disease, it's, I'd say, pretty likely that there's major involvement of different foods that we eat in potentially at least modulating that effect, or maybe even triggering it in some cases. So I myself have celiac disease, actually, self-diagnosed, but also actually totally confirmed diagnosis when I was studying nutrition. So fairly late. And, that's one good example that we know for sure that we have a component in a food that, very clearly and strongly triggers an autoimmune response. And, that one thing can make you insanely sick. It's almost certainly not that simple with other autoimmune or inflammatory diseases, but that's really something, if I had all the insights there of what the actual facts are, that would be pretty amazing, because I think that with that, we could probably do away with much of chronic disease.
We'll wait for you to come out with all that for us. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. Again, your website is Nourished by Science, correct? That's how they'll look it up. And we will have a link in there, folks. But nourishedbyscience.com. Check that out. That's where you get the evidence-based practices. You get the balance. You get the nuance. Again, Dr. Kratz and I don't have any relationship here or affiliation or anything like that. We just love what he's doing, and we're glad he could join us today. So thank you so much, my friend.
Really appreciate you having me. It was really fun talking to you. You're doing such a nice job with this podcast, and it's been really wonderful talking to you. And by the way, if I may say this, I'm just starting out with my website and my YouTube channel, and quite frankly, I'm still learning. This is, I used to be a professor, so okay. I'm used to talking. Right. I'm giving scientific talks, and I'm still learning how to make this information scientifically rigorous, but really a little bit more palatable to a wider audience. Sure. So if you or any one of your listeners, wants to check it out and has suggestions, hey, make this shorter, leave out that stuff.
You're open.
That's exactly what I'm looking for right now, because I want to make this content, really accessible to everyone, so that people can benefit from it, and that it's as clickable as, some of the misinformation we have right now, and the I think, overstated facts that we so often see.
And I'm almost certain you'll get that kind of response. The folks that listen, they send us such encouraging emails about the podcast and what's going on, and I'm sure they're happy to give you some feedback as you go through that. So folks, you heard the instructions. We've got an authentic scientist here who really wants your help, and let's help him out with this thing. So Dr. Kratz, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Take care.
The reason we started this podcast 6 years ago is a desire to bring evidence-based practices to the world of health and wellness, a world often dominated by fads and headlines. What a pleasure to have Dr. Kratz, whose mission is in exact alignment with that goal, join us today. Thanks for tuning in to the #1 podcast for health and wellness coaching. If you've been pondering pursuing your MBHWC-approved coach certification, our last cohort of the year kicks off the first weekend in October, but you can get started on the supplementary material now if you'd like. All the details are on our Institute site, catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or reach out anytime to discuss your specific situation and questions. Results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And now it's time to be a catalyst. This is Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching 360. Make it a great rest of your week, and I'll speak with you soon on another episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.